Hi, everyone. Welcome to WION Live broadcast from New York in collaboration with Voice of America. I'm Susan Tehrani, and let's start you off in the Middle East, where U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in Israel this week. He says he will work to help prolong a ceasefire so more hostages can be released and more humanitarian aid can be delivered to Gaza. At the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, Blinken tried to reassure allies of continued U.S. support for Ukraine as Kyiv prepares for another winter of fighting. VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent Cindy Sain reports.
Russia's defense ministry released video Wednesday. It says shows Russian fighter jets and artillery firing at Ukrainian targets. Russian forces have ramped up attacks on eastern Ukraine as the winter approaches. In Brussels, at a NATO foreign ministers meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken acknowledged that some have questioned whether the U.S. and other NATO allies should continue to stand with Ukraine almost 2 years after Russia's full-scale invasion.
But the answer here today at NATO is clear and it's unwavering. We must and we will continue to support Ukraine.
Blinken sought to reassure allies concerned that some Republican lawmakers in the U.S. Congress are reluctant to keep funding robust military aid for Ukraine. He said Speaker of the House Mike Johnson had spoken about the need to fund Kyiv recently, which Blinken called encouraging. One analyst told VOA additional funding for Ukraine is not in Blinken's hands.
There's not a great deal that Secretary Blinken from the executive branch can do about that. It's really in the hands of the legislature, a co-equal branch of government, and the Republican Party is sort of ironing out its differences or not ironing out its differences as we speak.
Kimmage told VOA that Blinken is sending a strong message by attending meetings of NATO and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, during the Israel-Hamas war.
And there is a kind of allegation out there or a claim out there that the U.S. Has now shifted attention to the Middle East and is doing less to engage with Europe. I think that Secretary Blinken, in going both to the NATO and the OSCE meetings, is very firmly trying to signal that the U.S. remains focused on Europe.
Blinken returns to the Middle East for talks Thursday and Friday, the third time since the militant group Hamas triggered the war with its October 7th attack on Israel. Blinken said he would work to prolong the truce so more Israeli hostages can be released and more humanitarian aid can be delivered to Palestinian civilians in Gaza who desperately need it. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
VOA's Jessica Stone is with us live from the White House. Hi, Jessica. Congress has less than 12 hours to pass a foreign aid package that aims to address funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, as well as Israel. What's the status quo so far?
Well, and actually, it's not 12 hours, but 12 days. But sometimes they feel like 12 hours because we really don't have a lot of time on the legislative calendar to pass this foreign aid bill, which is still taking shape as we speak. And we should note, too, of course, that truce, that temporary pause has now become not a pause at all. And so the fighting has resumed, and that's increasing the pressure on Congress here to come to some resolution on where it stands vis-a-vis funding Israel, Ukraine, and in this case also Taiwan. Those are all on the table, and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, saying he's going to bring this to a vote next week. Democrats divided, though, on whether to tie humanitarian aid to additional military aid for Israel, whether it's asking for a permanent ceasefire, whether it's asking for additional aid to go to Gaza and to the civilians there, asking Israel to reduce civilian casualties as it plans out its military operations. 20 senators meeting with the White House National Security Advisor here at the White House earlier this week on that idea. But pro-Israel Democrats are pushing back, saying Israel has a right to defend itself. Meantime, Republicans, they're split over the issue, as Cindy Sain outlined, about Ukraine and funding Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal reporting that more than half of Republicans in the Senate oppose money to Ukraine. And House Republicans, as we know, have tried unsuccessfully so far just to pass a standalone bill on funding Israel. That has not gone forward. They are also asking for this bill to include additional border security. Bottom line, this bill has to have enough for both parties to pass it. It's going to need both parties' support to pass the U.S. Congress. And so it's going to have something for everyone.
And Jessica, what did the American public think of all of this?
Yeah, it's interesting because the polling has really been moving around, and I took a look in advance of our conversation. The Ronald Reagan Institute poll taken late October and just released found that most Americans do support sending funds to Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel. In fact, 67% of Americans in that poll saying that they support additional arming of Ukraine. But a Reuters Ipsos poll taken in November says that number is actually 41% among the Americans it polled, asking them if they would support additional funds to arm Ukraine. Polling also shows that younger generations, specifically Generation Z, are less likely to support Israel in the current conflict than older Americans. For example, in a Tip Insights poll, 32% of Gen Z oppose Israel's ground invasion of Gaza, and 30% of Gen Z say they want equal aid to go to Ukraine and Israel. So there is a political calculation going into all these conversations on Capitol Hill. Susan?
Okay, well, stay with me, Jessica, while we go to a piece that you reported this week ahead of the UN climate change conference going on in Dubai. U.S. President Joe Biden will not be attending this week's 28th United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP28, but U.S. diplomats will be there, interested in getting access to the critical mineral exports necessary to transition to green energy. And Indonesia is positioning itself to be a new partner of choice. VOA's Jessica Stone reports.
When you drive a Tesla, the world's largest producer of electric vehicles, you're riding on a battery powered by critical minerals. Lithium from Chile, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and nickel from Indonesia. Currently, China dominates the market for the extraction and refining of these critical green energy battery components. But in November, Indonesian President Joko Widodo told business leaders that Jakarta wants to become an alternative partner of choice.
As home to the largest nickel reserves in the world and other critical minerals, Indonesia is in the process of building an EV integrated ecosystem and aims to produce 600,000 electric cars by 2030.
Bakri Group CEO Anandia Novian Bakri wants to take advantage of that pledge. He's pivoting his family's traditional Indonesian energy mining company into a renewable mining company that can also exploit the growing demand for a non-Chinese critical mineral supply chain.
If you want to focus not only to the east, to the west, there is not only market, but also enthusiasm, capital, and technology. So that's a good thing.
Indonesian mines are already partnering with Chinese refineries to process their minerals. Bakri says Jakarta needs support from Washington to compete.
So we're very optimistic, but I want to also highlight we don't have all the solutions, really, because we need serious capital, we need serious technology, because the only one we see that can, also catch up or even surpass will be the country that has IRA, Inflation Reduction Act.
In November, Widodo met with U.S. President Joe Biden to negotiate a critical minerals trade agreement that makes Indonesia eligible for U.S. subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act. But Southeast Asia expert Greg Poling says there's a long road ahead to approval.
Members of both parties on the Hill have been clear that any future agreement with Indonesia or other major mineral suppliers has to involve a lot of progress on labor and environmental standards, and may have to involve some kind of separation of the supply chain to make sure that Chinese companies working in those countries can't find backdoors to sell and qualify for IRA subsidies.
In the meantime, Jakarta is making progress on reducing Beijing's dominance in refining critical minerals. In 2020, it banned the export of nickel ore, and Indonesian law requires companies which mine to also refine domestically. Jessica Stone, VOA News, Washington.
VOA's Jessica Stone is back live with us now. Jessica, as you reported, President Biden is not attending in person, but he's certainly leveraging environmental issues on the campaign trail here in the United States. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's all about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which really doesn't sound like it has anything to do with climate, but has immense amounts of funding and subsidies for climate and particularly the green energy transition. As you heard in that piece, it's something the Indonesians are hoping to get a grasp of, and it's something that companies around this country are also already benefiting from. Joe Biden this week in Colorado at the largest wind turbine factory in the world, a Korean company that is already benefiting from the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies to create some 850 jobs. He makes the remarks, basically, he doesn't really talk a lot about the causes of climate change or the science of climate change on the campaign trail. He is talking about what he says he thinks about, which is, when I think of climate, I think of jobs. That's what he's saying on the climate, on the campaign trail. And it's important because the polling shows that most Americans are concerned about the economy, concerned about inflation, that they trust voters, that voters trust Republicans more than Democrats to address those issues. And 76% of Americans believe the country is headed in the wrong direction. So he has to overcome that polling. This is one way he's doing it. And he is sending Vice President Kamala Harris to Dubai to those COP28 talks in his stead. Susan?
Yeah, and speaking of Vice President Harris, as she'll be representing Washington at COP28, as you just mentioned, what will be the United States position going into these meetings?
Well, we got a sneak peek when we covered the APEC summit in San Francisco a couple of weeks back from climate envoy John Kerry. And he says, look, the main issue with the climate talks at COP28 going in is that we believe the U.S. and China have to cooperate, have to work together to bring developing nations and developed nations, the historic emitters like the United States, the newer emitters like China, to the table to make some kind of agreement. And they're really changing their position in these negotiations, which is really interesting. They are now getting away from reducing committing to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. They are actually getting around to talking about instead reducing their greenhouse gas emissions without any emissions capture technology. So a little bit of a finer point, but essentially they're now changing the measuring stick by which they talk about all of the aggregate emissions that they have. And they reached a deal ahead of COP28, China and the United States did, to have a global accounting of how far nations are from their emissions reduction goals by that new measuring stick. So a new tactic going into COP28. We'll see if it brings about some more unity amongst the historic emitters, the developed world and the developing world, the countries that are still emitting as we speak in order to industrialize their nations.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of that. Jessica Stone joining us live from the White House. Have a lovely weekend, Jessica, and it's always great talking to you.